This episode of All About Mythos originally aired on KWDC Delta College Radio and has been edited for YouTube. All research was done by Nico. Any potential misinformation is unintentional and caused by human error in the research process. Thank you for listening. My name is Nico, and I'm actually doing a solo episode this week. So our show topic today is a return to Greek mythology with Dionysus and Hestia, so sit back and enjoy our show. Hello to all listeners, welcome to All About Mythos, the radio show about mythology from all around the world. Today I'll be talking about Dionysus and a little bit about Hestia. So this week has been pretty hectic, I'm not gonna lie. Last week we had my co-host Dani went to Michigan for a speech and debate tournament, so we didn't really have time to organize a time to meet up for that English mythology episode, so I'm just doing this one on my own. So we're returning to Greek mythology, and Dionysus is one of my favorite gods. I just think he's a really cool god. So he's also the main god that I see misinterpreted most often. And a bit of background about my mythology knowledge. I'm not actually entirely sure how I got into Greek mythology or just mythology in general. There are two influences that I know I have, which is Class of the Titans, which was a kids show on Cubo that I grew up watching, and then Percy Jackson and the Olympians is the big one that I'm still into today. I got into Percy Jackson and the Olympians when I was in 4th grade. But what's interesting about that is, while I was researching Dionysus and stories about Dionysus, I knew the story, but I knew that I didn't learn, or I knew one of the myths that I'm going to be talking about with Dionysus, but I know that it didn't come from Class of the Titans or Percy Jackson and the Olympians. So here's the thing, right? I grew up without cable TV. We didn't have the money for it. So I was raised mostly on PBS Kids and Cubo, and I think my knowledge of Greek mythology comes from this one show with like a talking bison, and I don't remember the name of it, and I don't think it was a very popular show on either Cubo or PBS Kids, but it talked a lot about Greek mythology. And there was also an episode they had on Tom Sawyer, and that's where I learned about that story. But that's where my Greek mythology knowledge comes from, and I have no idea what that show was called, but I need to figure it out, because I don't know. It feels like the only show from my childhood that actually told accurate stories on Greek mythology. But anyway, that rant aside, let's talk about Dionysus. So I'm going to talk about the Class of the Titans and the Percy Jackson and the Olympians interpretations of him, because both of them are very wrong and inaccurate to real mythology. But Class of the Titans, I have such a beef with the way that they interpreted Dionysus. So a lot of misinterpretations of Dionysus is likely for two reasons. For one, he's the god of wine, and that's not appropriate for children, and it can't be shown in children's shows. And for another, he's known as the god of ecstasy, and a lot of the way that he was worshipped is not appropriate for kids, and I'm gonna have to censor so much about him for this episode. So, the Class of the Titans interpretation of Poseidon, he is a scientist for some reason. The episode that he was introduced, one of the characters was basically introduced to him by Hera, and that character was like, hey, isn't he? And then made a motion to imply drinking. So basically going, isn't he a drunkard? And Hera responded to that by saying, no, he's turned his knowledge of making alcohol and getting drunk into a more scientific route. So now he's a scientist, and not just, like, Dionysus in actual mythology is described as youthful, beautiful, effeminate. He's kind of known for just messing around and having fun. And this version of Dionysus in Class of the Titans is a nerd. He wears like bifocal glasses. He speaks so weirdly. Like, I don't even know how you get to that with Dionysus. It's wild. But yeah, they also did something really weird with Hades where they gave him that stereotypical flamboyant gay voice, and I don't even know what the logic behind that was. Like, I love Clash of the Titans. I watch all of the episodes like whenever I get bored and just need something in the background to run. But the choices they made with the gods is just so fascinating to me. It's so weird. But anyway, that's Clash of the Titans. That's my beef with how they portrayed Dionysus. By far, the worst interpretation of Dionysus I've ever seen, because it is just so inaccurate. And so they could have made him kid-friendly in a much better way. But anyway, and then there's Percy Jackson, which I like Mr. D in Percy Jackson. It's just not completely accurate. But the way that I interpret him in that is that, because in Percy Jackson, he's basically forced to run the camp for demigod children for like thousands of years because he went after a nymph that Zeus had eyes for. So the way that I interpret him in that version is that he's basically just bitter at the world. So that's the way that I interpret that version of Dionysus. That makes it a little bit better. So anyway, most modern depictions of Dionysus, I've heard, are actually more similar to Bacchus, which is like his Roman form. And you can debate whether or not Greek and Roman gods are the same, or if they're like an assimilated version of Greek gods that, like, when the Romans attacked Greece and forced them to convert to their religion, that it was basically like the Romans' way of converting Greece people. That's one way that I heard it. I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to give an opinion on that. But Roman society was very based around laws and propriety and stuff, and they usually called him Bacchus in reference to the mad frenzies that were associated with his cult. And one time in 186 BCE, there was an investigation into the cult of Bacchus, which resulted in restrictions on their activities, and there was a ban on men becoming priests of Bacchus, because for some reason they believed worshippers would be safer if the cults of Bacchus were smaller and run by women. And I just want to make a point real quick that the use of the word cult when it comes to Greek mythology and the worship of Greek gods is very different from the modern interpretation or the modern definition of what a cult is. The way that I've seen cult be used in Greek mythology is more like a cult following, or kind of like a church, sort of. So it's just a group of people who believed in the Greek gods. So Dionysus is the god of wine, vegetation, pleasure, festivity, madness, and wild frenzy. And one thing that I found that I didn't actually know before researching this is that some people actually do call him the god of homosexuality, effeminacy, and cross-dressing, which I found to be very interesting. So let's get into his birth, and he's actually often called the twice-born god, and his story varies widely with who his parent is and where he was born, but the most common interpretation is that he's a child of Zeus and the mortal princess Semele of Thebes. And when Hera found out that Zeus was with Semele, she became jealous like she usually does in these kinds of myths, and she tricked Semele into asking Zeus to appear in his true form to her. And the true form of gods, it can kill mortals by just them looking at it. But she eventually convinces Zeus, so he complies, and seeing his true form and the heat of his lightning bolts kills Semele. So Semele took the unborn body of Dionysus from Semele and sewed him into his thigh. So that's where the second birth thing comes from, is that he was born the second time out of Zeus's thigh. And there's also a chance that the thigh part of the myth is symbolic of a different kind of organ, which I can't mention on here, but people who are older than 18, you're going to know what I'm talking about. So there's a chance that he was actually sewn into that part of the body, but Greeks were usually very literal with that part of the body, so it's likely that interpretation isn't true, but I just find it funny. So after he was born from Zeus's thigh, he was taken to the nymphs of Mount Nysa and raised there, and some versions of the myth say that he was raised as a girl until adulthood, and that's likely where the idea of him being the god of cross-dressing and homosexuality came from. And now we're going to get into that story that I heard from the Talking Bison on PBS or Cubo or wherever, and it's the creation of the dolphin. So in this story, Dionysus was captured by Tyrsonoi pirates, and they thought that he was like a wealthy prince, so they were planning on either selling him or forcing him to give them money to let him go. So they tried binding him by his hands and feet, and all of those bindings ended up just falling off of him because he's a god. And the only person that realized that he was a god was the helmsman of the ship. And the helmsman panics and tells the rest of the crew to release the guy because he was like, oh no, this is a god, we're gonna die. But the master of the ship ignored him completely, and the master of the ship was just really sure that he was a prince, and that he would eventually tell them about his wealth, or the wealthy friends that they could exploit. So they tried sailing off with him to, I think it was Egypt. I didn't take note of where it was, but I think it changes depending on the interpretation. But Dionysus causes vines to grow across the sails and masts, and they produce like berries and grapes and a whole bunch of stuff. And that's what causes the crew to finally believe the helmsman and start sailing towards land. And that's when Dionysus turns into a lion and also created a bear. From what I read, the bear didn't do anything, so it was really just to scare the crew. And Dionysus, as the lion, ended up attacking the master, and all the other sailors freaked out and threw themselves overboard, which is how they became the first dolphins. And then Dionysus showed mercy to the helmsman because he was the only one that realized that he was a god, and he decided that the helmsman now had his favor. So that's that story, and it's interesting that he was the one who created dolphins, because if you know anything about how dolphins actually are, like real dolphins and not the sanitized version of what dolphins are that you teach children, you know what I'm talking about. It's interesting that he was the one that created dolphins, because I don't know, the Greeks just knew what dolphins were actually like, and they were like, yep, that's Dionysus's creation. So along with being a digital media major, I'm also a big fan of theater, and I've taken a lot of theater classes, and one of the classes that I took was a history of theater class, and one of the discussions was about Dionysus, because theater is a big part of ancient Greek culture, and it's a lot of how culture has been preserved and what we know about their culture from what I know. And Dionysus was known as the god of theater, or at least he was heavily associated with theater. So a lot of the worship of him comes from theater. So Dionysus had mainly female followers, which were called maenads, coming from a word meaning mad or demented. And there were ancient festivals of Dionysia, which were festivals dedicated to Dionysus. So Dionysus was seen in Greek culture as like a liberator, and the festivals actually allowed women, slaves, and prisoners to experience liberation and freedom during the festival, because they were usually like locked away. And it gave pretty much everyone just freedom from social constraints. And the biggest festival known to worship Dionysus was the city Dionysia Festival in Athens, and it always started by carrying a wooden effigy of Dionysus through the city to the temple. and sacrifices were made, hymns were sung at the temple, and then the effigy would be brought to the theater of Dionysus. And what's interesting is that women played an actually very important role in festivals for Dionysus, and that's very important because women were usually forbidden from taking part in public or religious affairs, and they could often only go out in public when they had a male family member next to them or around them. And here's the thing that I learned from my drama class, which I couldn't find anywhere online, which I found to be interesting, but it's what I learned in my theater class. It was that Dionysia had secret festivals that were performed solely by women, and one of the things that I heard was these maenads, or female followers of Dionysus. They were said to wander around the mountains and forests in a frenzy. I think they were also drunk. They were usually wandering around naked, and they believed that they were possessed by Dionysus. And they were said to dance and drink and generally just have a whole bunch of fun, just as a whole group of women wandering around the forest or mountains, or I think bathing in lakes and stuff. But they were also known to be a bit aggressive, so they would sometimes catch animals and tear them open with their bare hands and offer them as sacrifices to Dionysus. And if a man ever came across them, they would just attack him. But that was one of the things that I learned, and I found that to be very interesting. So anyway, we're going to get into Hestia now. So there's unfortunately not a whole lot about Hestia, but she's probably my favorite Greek goddess. Mainly just, it's like a thing in the Percy Jackson fandom that Hestia is the only good god. Because, Percy Jackson portrays the gods in a very negative light, and it's something that a lot of Hellenists have been mad about, but to be fair, if you go just solely off of the stories that are told about the gods and just ignore religious practices or religious people's views on their gods, and you go just solely off of the myths and how they act in those myths, it makes sense that they would be really terrible. So anyway, Hestia is the virgin goddess of the hearth and the home, and she was typically the one who received a small share of every sacrifice to the gods, because she was known also as the goddess of the sacrificial flame. And she's considered both the eldest and the youngest child of Kronos, because she was the firstborn child of him, but she was also the last to come out of Kronos' stomach. So for those who don't know, so I feel like the story of Kronos and how he swallowed his kids is a pretty well-known part of Greek mythology. I feel like a lot of people know, but that might also be because I'm just really into Greek mythology. But basically, Kronos had, I think, 6 kids, if I remember right, which were the first 6 Olympians. And he basically heard this prophecy that one of his kids would overthrow him, and he decided, okay, I don't want to be overthrown, so he just swallowed all of his kids. And his wife tricked him into eating a rock when Zeus was born. So he ate that rock, and his wife managed to hide Zeus and raise him, and that's how Zeus eventually overthrew his father. So Hestia, firstborn, last to come out of Kronos' stomach, so she's considered both eldest and youngest, and she was content to just tend the hearth on Olympus and not have a throne, so she ended up just giving her throne away to Dionysus when he became a god, or when he ascended to Olympus. And that's why, despite being one of Kronos' children, she technically isn't one of the Olympians, while Dionysus is. And she's a virgin goddess because both Apollo and Poseidon sought her hand in marriage, and she refused both of them and instead asked Zeus to make her an eternal maiden. So she, along with Athena, Artemis, and I believe Hecate, or Hecate, there are different ways to pronounce her name. I go by Hecate because that's how I think I've heard Hellenists pronounce her name. But that makes her one of those 4 well-known maiden goddesses. So when sacrifices to the gods are made, usually Hestia is the one that's invoked first, and part of the sacrifice is made to her, because I've heard Hellenists call her like a sort of like a gateway goddess or a gateway deity. Like, I think that's a thing in pretty much every religion, or at least every pagan religion, is that there's a goddess that you always sort of go through. And I think Greek mythology has 2, which are Hestia and Hermes, but I just think that's a really interesting part about the religion side of Greek mythology. So towns and cities in Greece often had a sacred public hearth, and that sacred public hearth often symbolized like their harmonious community, or the community, or the common worship and practices that they had. And this public hearth was also seen as the sacred asylum of every town. I saw that they use it as like a meeting spot for like people from different towns. And then, despite how widely worshipped she was, like I said, she doesn't have a whole lot of myths about her, and she's mostly just referenced in other myths for other gods' stories. And she also didn't have that many temples. I don't think she really had any art of her, or at least not nearly as much as a bunch of other more well-known gods. But she was mainly just a home goddess. Like, she was worshipped within the home, and then she also had some like hearths in civic centers, and I think in the courtrooms or something like that. I don't remember exactly what, but yeah, she was just worshipped more privately, I'd say. But anyway, that wraps up all of my notes, and I don't know, I wish there was more about Hestia, because I think she's just a really nice goddess, and maybe that's just the Percy Jackson bias in me, but like, I don't know, I just wish there was more about her, because I'd love to know more about Hestia, and I feel like Hestia is very important when it comes to understanding how ancient Greek people practiced their religion, and how, I don't know, just how the everyday lives of ancient Greek people were, because she basically oversaw all of the practices, all of the prayers. There were a bunch of sacrificial feasts that she was said to oversee, and she was just the one watching over everything, pretty much. And then, as for Dionysus, I understand why he is so commonly misinterpreted, but I just can't get over that Class of the Titans interpretation, because it is I just don't understand how they got to that. I don't understand it. Like, there's so many better ways to make him child-friendly. But yeah, Dionysus is, I think I saw somewhere that he was originally a fertility god, which I think it's really cool, because fertility gods are usually women, but Dionysus was like, he was a male god. He's never interpreted as a female god or transgender or intersex or anything like that. He's like very clearly a male god, and he was worshipped as a male god. Anyway, that's the episode for today. Very different because I'm doing this solo. But next week we will definitely be doing the English mythology episode. I'm not gonna lie, I've done a little bit of research so far for it, and it's not the most interesting, I'm not gonna lie. But we'll work with it. We'll see what we can do. So to cite my sources for this, again, theoi.com. That's THEOI. Very good resource for learning about Greek mythology and the Greek gods. Then I also got stuff from the blog Honor the Gods, and then also a tiny bit from Britannica, and then also thecollector.com. So next week we're doing that English mythology, maybe a little bit of Christian mythology. We'll see about that when I do the research for that because I've been procrastinating. I've been very busy. I'm very stressed and tired, but it's fine. We're working with it. We're doing what we can. So I'll see you next week for that episode, and thank you for listening. Bye.